On the screen here, you'll see some of the engagement activities that we covered as part of our plan. This included meetings with 2 public meetings, our Vision Zero Advisory Committee meetings, our municipal briefing that we held, as well as attending our regular MPO meetings and providing a 3-phased approach and update for the MPO members. We conducted a regional Vision Zero survey that allowed for crowdsourcing and project identification from residents and stakeholders across the NMCOG region. We also used tools like Reddit, Nextdoor.com. I handed out flyers at Market Basket. We also posted a few ads in the Lowell Sun. There are also some other groups and agencies that we worked with throughout the city of Lowell and our adjacent communities. This included the Mass Bike Coalition, as well as the Lowell-based Bike Connector. I'd like to talk a little bit about our plan development. As part of this plan, we worked with
Jessica, I'm sorry, I don't believe the slides are advancing for our Zoom users. You may have to keep that moving.
Oh, they're probably seeing the back end. So if you escape out, stop share, and then go back, first project the slides before you hit share. Yeah, so go down to present, and now if you go back to Zoom and hit share, or if you just do Alt Tab.
Let's see. So here it is. I'm losing my screen share every time.
Oh, shoot.
So screen share.
You may need to do it this way then.
There you go. You're good. We can see
But
it.
when I go to full screen, people lose it. Can you see this, Nate?
Yes, I can.
Let's try advancing. How about now?
It's not advancing. You were advancing previously, but
And Nate, are you seeing the PowerPoint side of things instead of the screen projection?
Like the
Yeah.
notes?
Yeah.
I'm
okay.
not seeing the notes pane. I'm just seeing it. I'm seeing 1, 2, 3 down the side. I imagine you could probably still be editing it.
Well, now.
No difference. Perfect. Now you've got it.
Oh, great.
Okay. Not sure what I did, but I'm glad it's working now. So on the screen, you'll
Don't touch anything.
see. Okay. You'll see the 3 elements of the plan development. As part of this planning process, we developed a high injury network, a high risk network, and then the third is to really learn about how we can eliminate crashes. So we created a combined network. The high injury network looks at where our fatal and serious injuries are currently occurring. The high risk network considers where crashes are most likely to occur. And together, those 2 networks establish a priority network that will be used to eliminate crashes in the future. On the screen, you will see the data that goes into creating a high injury network. This is a retrospective tool that looks at 5 years of crash data. For this project, we used data from the MassDOT Impact Portal. And we targeted locations with high frequency or densities of fatal, which is the K, or serious injuries, which is the ASI, crash events. In establishing a high injury network, it helps us prioritize improvements by creating a risk score or weighing a specific risk severity. And these are on the bottom right of the screen, you'll see the ratings that were attached to each type of injury description. Next, you'll see on the screen the high injury corridors with equity priority areas that have been overlaid. For the purpose of this exercise, we looked at specific equity indicators in our region. This included seniors, limited English proficiency, race, folks that do not own cars, to help understand how equity factors into the crash corridors in our region. We know that there's a greater severity of injuries in our equity focused areas across the region. The high risk network is really a forward-looking tool. It's a predictive modeling that helps us look at where crashes are possibly going to occur in the future. And it targets facilities with infrastructure or operational elements that have contributed to the risk of KSI, or killed or serious injury events. On the screen here, you'll see some of the risk factors that we utilized as part of this plan. This included average daily traffic, the number of travel lanes, speed limits, equity areas, and pedestrian exposure. Those two components, the high injury network and the high risk network, have helped us establish one regional priority network. It blends the two networks to help us understand the potential for future accidents. And on the screen here, you'll see this lovely matrix that the WSP team helped us establish. And the areas in black are the priority networks. So for example, if a project was on the highest high injury network and high risk network, then it would be considered a priority number one. The items that did not arrive on the high injury network or on the high risk network were not included in the plan analysis. Under this plan, our deliverables are a list of identified projects. And these are projects throughout our region in all 9 of our communities, along with a list of recommended countermeasures. The countermeasures are federal highway approved recommended roadway treatments that can be used to improve or reduce the likelihood of accidents. We will have a set of high injury networks and high risk networks that have been established. Those networks will be utilized in the future in our project work, including things such as the TIP or possibly in our EPWP and project implementation going forward. We also have a list of equity indicators or transportation specific equity indicators. In the past, the environmental justice networks that have been established by the state have been utilized to inform a lot of the project work, but we're now seeing that that criteria is simply not enough. There's other factors that go into being qualified as an equity community, for example, not having a car. That's an added vulnerability that's being added to the equity indicators. And the state has come out with a model, it's called the REJ Plus. So that's the Regional Equity Indicators, Environmental Justice Plus. And that includes a lot of the factors that we utilized in this plan. Including WSP has been working with us to develop a web-based dashboard. That dashboard will be found on the NMMPO website, and our communities will have the ability to go onto the website and look at projects and view our progress towards our goals and follow up on the commitment that we make towards Vision Zero. Some highlights of what is included in our draft plan are the identified list of projects and recommended countermeasures, as well as a list of areas for future study or recommended review. The plan also includes some actionable strategies, and these are policy implications. And these are behavioral, operational, and infrastructure related strategies. We also included project identification maps, like the one that you see on the screen here. This is an example from the town of Billerica, and it displays a project as well as some identified projects in their community. In order to establish our list of identified projects, current TIP projects as well as recently completed TIP projects were evaluated to confirm and ensure that we were not duplicating our efforts. If there had been a recently completed TIP project in a community, we reached out to the planners to learn what's the status of the TIP project, how long has it been completed, and if it was a recent treatment, we might not include it in the network because that would help us. We need to wait a little bit longer to actually see how the project and treatment was applied and if that actually did reduce the crashes. On the screen here, you'll see a list of the federal highway recommended countermeasures. So there's 28 on the screen. The top left has this big asterisk through the speed cameras. Currently, they are not legal in Massachusetts. However, there are discussions on the state level to consider adding speed cameras and possible automated enforcement using cameras, but we are not recommending that as part of the plan. Most importantly, this plan will include a set of actionable strategies. Accountability, safety, data-informed decision-making, and maintaining and building infrastructure are really the most important policies that we're hoping to utilize to inform the plan and continue advancing our work in Vision Zero. In terms of accountability, transparency is critical to the goal. How are we going to maintain we're going to maintain an online dashboard to help monitor our progress towards those goals. And that's one of the ways that we're hoping to stay accountable. We've developed a Vision Zero advisory committee that will help us with the development and the implementation of the plan. So they've been working closely with me to help develop the plan, but now that the plan's over, we'll be continuing to work with that group of people to inform our implementation strategy and help us really reach the goal of Vision Zero. We're using safety to help inform our plan development and develop and advance a regional safety culture through the forms of education, community outreach, and working with our communities to find out where the gaps in knowledge when it comes to safety are and how can we work to address those. We'll be using more data-informed decision-making. So as I mentioned before, we now have the high injury network, the high risk network. How can we utilize the data that we have to help inform other projects? That might include something like our economic development work, our housing strategy, and other transportation-related projects. The last item is maintaining and building infrastructure. As part of this planning process, we will set measurable goals with clear timelines and implementation strategies. And as part of this, we're hoping to build capacity for projects throughout our region, whether that is working closely with our municipalities for grants or finding other ways to help them advance their projects, whether it be on the TIP or through the SS4A project. On the screen here, you'll see our project timeline. The plan was released at our May MPO meeting, and the public comment period will remain open until June 12th. At the July MPO meeting, I will present the comments that we've received and how we will address them. And then at the July MPO meeting, I will also request endorsement from the board. So on the screen here, you'll see our important dates that we have coming up that I just mentioned. Today is the public forum, and then July is the MPO meeting. And that concludes my presentation. I think at this time we can open up for questions from the audience.
I was just going to remind our Zoom participants that if you want to, please raise your hand so that everybody can hear what you have to say. We definitely encourage you to do so. I will unmute you the second I see a hand pop up. So please feel free to participate. I am watching for that.
Another question?
Yep, I was gonna say, is there anybody else in the room there with you, Jessica?
Yep, we have one hand up from Andrew Jennings.
All right, and then we'll go to Paul Cohen.
My name is Andrew Jennings. I serve on the board of the Lowell Regional Transit Authority and generally a transportation activist in my hometown of Billerica. First question is, how common is this methodology that you use to determine high-risk networks? Is it new? Has it been around for a while? Can you give examples where it has been implemented in the past?
Sure, just taking that one down normally. Yes, it's honestly something that, when I was in grad school would have been a fantasy dream or something that you might see a paper about. But over the past, let's say 5 years, has really been rolled out, I don't want to say across America, but in some of the larger communities that have been, kind of at the forefront of this effort. So the federal program is somewhat prescriptive in terms of the steps that you have to take. Developing a high entry network is fundamentally like one of those prerequisite steps, right? Some of it is very black and white, boring, incredibly rote and technical. Some of it can be a little bit artistic and loose, and you get to play at the margins. In terms of really developing the high entry network itself, you can get different results depending on the weights you apply to different severities of crashes. We based ours on a combination of federal guidance as well as some of the things that we've seen in other studies that the firm has conducted, be they in San Francisco or elsewhere down in Miami. Some of the key things to think about is really just making sure you're tying the valuations of fatal versus serious injury and serious injury relative to other things below in a nice kind of scaled way. We use a value of 15 for fatal here. Sometimes you'll see a value of 20, sometimes you'll see a value of 12. That part is somewhat arbitrary. The point is that as you scale down across the different injury levels, you kind of see this nice consistent accordion, and that's what we attempted to apply here.
Did you do any testing of time periods? For example, if you had done 8 years ago to 3 years ago, would the map have looked different? Did you play around with that to get a sense of how stable this network is?
Yeah, to be honest, we have not done hardcore sensitivity analysis on this. In terms of how far you cast your net, I think the industry standard is if you're in a super large area where the sample size is large enough, like a heavily urbanized place like the city of Boston, maybe you could get by with just 3 or 4 years of data, right? You have enough incidents to really focus. As the level of activity in your study area goes down, you really do have to scale out a bit and take in a larger sample size to get to something that you're confident about. I'd say the standard or rule of thumb is typically about 5 years worth of data. That is what we used here. I've seen other studies go out to 7 or 8, particularly when they're looking specifically at smaller subsets of crashes, be they pedestrians or cyclists. But it is relatively common to use about 5, sometimes going a bit more. With that, what you're putting into it fundamentally determines where those lines are. One of the things that we went through in terms of figuring out which of these lines might actually be relevant, right, is going back through the recently completed TIP project list as well as the upcoming one. So there were a few buckets where, and looking at the priority network and the various colors in the various places, my colleague Zach here had otherwise kind of identified a cluster. And looking back through that history via a wonderful, very long list of tables that you had provided, we had tried to ascertain, okay, if that's a deep black or a deep red line here that indicates a lot of risk, what's the nature of that, right? If a TIP project had been completed 3 or 4 years ago, is the crash history we're seeing indicative of that project being completed or not, right? Is it all stacked in the first year or two and then the project happened and it dwindled away, or does it persist? So we did attempt to at least look back to see, what had been completed and if the areas identified in that 5-year window were still kind of relevant, so to speak. Granted, that's a somewhat subjective process. It was definitely something we looked at, but if you cut it off at 3 years, you will get variations in the map, right? There are going to be some facilities that I think are pretty stable. If it's, identified as the highest risk within a 5-year batch, odds are if we take that down to 3 years or to 7 years, it's still going to perform in that top tranche, right? I think where you'll see a lot of adjustments on the sensitivity side is, say we have 4 levels of priority as we did here. A lot of the margins, I think, are going to shift all over the place, right? So the stuff in priority 4 or priority 3, when you're using a different batch of data, is necessarily going to move around a little bit in response to that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. The particular situation that I scratch my head about is Billerica Center, where I took some older data and there were a number of crashes there, but very little of a serious injury or fatal transaction. And then I found out that in the time period which you included, which was included more recent data, that there was a spike in the fatal and serious injury data, making it, actually changing its position in the priority network. One final question. I didn't see modal shift as a strategy here. I realize that, the monies that come in are primarily capital money, but where do you see that modal shift fits into this, both good and bad? Because if we shift more to active transportation, those persons using it become more vulnerable, and you'll actually expect many of the safety statistics look and go down in the wrong direction.
That is definitely a valid question. I will provide some space for my colleague here to opine perhaps on how she would look to integrate modal shift. But at a broad level, I think your point is well taken. There is kind of this transitional period where it gets first before it gets better, if we're being honest, right? So you have this transition where people are starting to do something different. But, you know, the overall basis or landscape in which they are led to behave maybe hasn't responded to that behavior, or their fellow users haven't quite caught up, so to speak, in terms of being aware of them, taking them into account. It does not happen overnight, you know, everybody loves to have fun and show pictures of the Netherlands, and I went there and it's great. They, you know, caused a ruckus over 50 years ago, were fully in the streets, and you know, that led to change. What we see now there as something that works and it's just second nature is, you know, not at all by accident, but also in any stretch of the imagination did not happen overnight, right? So I think there's definitely something to be said about, you know, potentially identifying a proxy here. And as much as taking people off the road is going to inherently be reduce that overall exposure level. I think that's a valid objective, but I think you're right to bring up in terms of how a program that is heavily based in capital funding for roadway projects really starts to chip away at the longer term strategy of pushing it over. With that, wanted to provide some space here if you wanted to talk about transit at all.
Sure. Thank you for your comments, Andrew. I always appreciate hearing your perspective. I think one thing I really like about the Vision Zero or SS4A program is that there's two elements. It's really a data-driven plan where they're using data to make decisions and inform infrastructure projects. But the other side of it is really the policy aspect. And we're hoping to make some behavioral shifts with the policy recommendations in this plan. That might include something along the lines of a safety campaign and educating folks on mode shift. The plan includes vulnerable users, so pedestrians and cyclists, but this is also, plans also focused on reducing motor vehicle accidents. And that can be motorist on motorist. So you mentioned that in Philrick, for example, there are some property damage accidents that you noticed were happening, a trend maybe towards that. So how can we shift people out of cars so those are less likely to happen? And through that can be an education campaign or thinking about other ways to address safety challenges and safety work.
Thank you.
I'm gonna ask Paul Cohen to ask his question. Paul, you unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Hi, good evening. Thank you again for the work and the presentation this evening. The questions that I have, sort of context, I mean, I was surprised to find that the #1 project in terms of benefit cost ratio was actually in Chelmsford. You know, it was a rather modest project in terms of estimated costs. And I guess my first question is, where can one obtain additional information about this? For example, it's a very specific cost, $722,000. So I'd obviously be interested to know what that consists of, what the recommended, more details regarding the recommended countermeasures, and then also how the estimated benefit was calculated. So again, where would we obtain additional information regarding specific projects that are on table 36, the project list?
Gotcha. Indeed, definitely a reasonable question. Table 36 is a large table. I did my best, but obviously we couldn't fit everything into it. In terms of where the costs come from, you will see, I believe, within chapter 6, there's kind of a first half that has a few tables. It notes at a rough, you know, element level what that would be. In terms of how we got to that magic number at the end, my colleague over here, Dominic, who has done this thing here and there a few times, effectively reviewed the area at, you know, kind of a top-down approach, if we're being honest, and intended to figure out across, you know, these 27 countermeasures that we list up front here, which of these might be relevant based on the crash history, and applying those at a broad, you know, kind of 30,000 level. Tabulated those elements to produce the cost. In terms of where the benefits come from, my other colleague over here, Zach, did a pretty strong job of otherwise scanning through the 5 years of data that we present, you know, the HIN and the HRN to be all based out. We effectively took those project areas and said, show me everything related to corridor crashes in that extent. And then we effectively said, show me everything related to intersection crashes in that extent. And then relative to, you know, the crash reduction factors that are listed in that table, but also coming from, you know, FHWA and the Crash Modification Clearinghouse. We were then kind of tabulating those in a combination to otherwise apply them to the subset of corridor crashes or the subset of intersection crashes, depending on what the actual countermeasure was. I think that's probably as much detail as I'm gonna go into now, ahead of totally losing anybody in the weeds here. In terms of where you can find more of that, I imagine we will probably need another appendix to come out in this final report. But it is a very valid question. You know, the countermeasures that you see listed in that table are effectively just a very complicated reading of that giant table of cost estimates and benefits that we had used. So yeah, understand you're looking for additional data, can provide that as part of the plan.
And how was, oh, sorry, I think you had asked also how the benefit was calculated. Is that,
Yes,
Yep, I think I was going there, but maybe I didn't get all the way there. Yes, so each of these countermeasures has a literature review based percentage of reduction of crashes. So whenever we tabulated the use of such a countermeasure in that area, we said, hello, this is what people think crashes are going to be reduced. So go ahead and take that into the equation. I, wanted to be very clear about how we split those out. We didn't, lump all of the crashes together and say an intersection improvement addresses a piece of these and a corridor improvement addresses a piece of these. We split them totally apart such that we could at least be confident in terms of apples to apples and oranges to oranges, in terms of whether or not us spending money was going to address a specific type of crash. Does that make sense?
We have I'm going to do a quick, I would ask that, Paul, if you can just put your hand back down again, just so I have an accurate count. Yeah, just so I know who's had their bite at the apple. Thank you very much, sir. Brian, before I come to you, we have a quick one that was typed in, and I'll read it so everybody gets a chance to hear it. This is Josh Warhurst from Chelmsford. My one question: is there a good way to identify places that are easier to change? For instance, a road that's 30 years old is easier to fix than a 5 years old road. Wondering how that might factor in.
Sorry, just trying to write that one down. A pretty good question. I do not have an immediate answer for you, unfortunately, Josh. In terms of, advancing a project that might be in this list and how, long it's been since work has been done. Obviously, the longer ago dirt was turned, the easier it might be for you to advance something different because that project will come back up. Something implemented 5 years ago is going to be more difficult at a conversation level to lead people to get behind you, regardless of the level of need that might be demonstrated by any sort of map, right? So I think at a broad level, how recent is it would be one factor. Beyond that, I think it would often be pretty site specific. You're going to have various constraints depending on how the roadway slopes, et cetera. But in terms of developing a typology for things that are easier to fix than others, I think a 2-lane road would be at the very bottom of that of, most constrained, least room for play. And, the more lanes and the wider that right of way gets, then, the more theoretical room you have to do something differently. Whether or not you will get there politically is, its own battle each time. But yeah, I think in general, the more historic and built up, it's going to be a bit more difficult to do something different. That is honestly a good question and something I will kind of orient to as we go through this process and others.
To build upon what Joel said, is essentially in developing the high injury network and the high risk network, those have helped us identify project areas. So in order for a project to be considered for implementation funding, it must be appearing on the high injury or high risk network. So it must be shown on the priority network that we've established. For example, there could be an instance where we've developed a priority network in our region, and perhaps a community has recently completed a resurfacing project. if we recommend a project in that community, that might not be very favorable among residents because they just paid to resurface the road. They're not gonna be interested in tearing the roads up to do some type of countermeasure, for instance. So that's something that we're grappling with, but in most instances, there were opportunities. There was very few instances where a road has recently been repaid and it presented a challenge.
So if there are no questions in the room, Brian, your hand has been going up and down. Did you mean to do that? Did you mean to pull it back down? Would you like to say something? I'm gonna just give you the opportunity. So if you have something to say, please unmute and say it.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to pop it in the chat because it might have been a little easier for everyone to keep track of it. My name is Brian Januzzi, and I'm a Tewksbury resident. And you know, I share a similar concern about modal shift kind of skewing the KSI data over time. And you know, as our residents feel safer on the streets and start to use this infrastructure at higher rates, I'm curious if there's going to be any tracking of vulnerable user activity, or if that'll be published on the dashboard in order to, you know, kind of compensate or adjust for increased activity, skewing data in the short term before behavioral changes kick in.
That's a really good question, Brian. So we are working really closely with the state. The state has recently developed a vulnerable user, the 4-foot passing law. As part of that effort, they've also developed a story map where they're tracking vulnerable user related accidents. Most recently, they're starting to look at vulnerable users as it relates to transit stops. So we've been involved in those conversations and participating. On the impact portal data that WSP used as part of developing our high injury networks, we're able to filter the results by injury type, whether it be a pedestrian, a cyclist, et cetera. So we do have that data and it's updated regularly. And that information comes directly from municipal first responders, so police and fire departments. And also if an injury might be a serious injury and it changes and it's now a fatality, for instance, that data is the latest and greatest that most of the regional planning agencies are using. Did that answer?
Thank you. I think so. Thank you very much. And overall, I loved reading through this plan, and I'm very excited about all the proposals you all are making.
Thank you. Well, thank you to WSP and the project team.
Yes, I was going to say, Brian, thank you for those kind words. We all worked on it. Paul, you have your hand up again. Before I come back to you, folks in the room, I don't know if I can fully see everybody there. Jessica, is there anybody who has a hand up physically?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Is there anybody who is out there in Radio Land who has not spoken yet? Before I come back to Paul. All right, Paula, we never muted you again because it's a small enough audience that we don't have to be quite that formal. So please, the floor is yours.
No, just a quick question. I think it's general to other communities. The road safety audit recommendations on a road that's not controlled by the community. In our case, it'd be Drum Hill Rotary, which is a state-owned rotary because it overrides or physically is above the Route 3. How does that advance? In other words, is that study move forwarded by the community, or is it move forward by the state, or is it how does something like that move along where the jurisdictional issue isn't in the control of a municipality?
Hi, Paul. Thank you for attending. That's a great question. As far as state-owned roads, municipalities have the opportunity to initiate projects that are on state-owned roads through the MassDOT TIP process. So municipalities have the option to initiate projects on state-owned roads, and they work with a project manager at the Department of Transportation to advance the project. There are some MassDOT standards because it is a state-owned road that the municipality would have to comply with, but they can still be initiated by a member of the municipality.
Thank you.
Sure.
And that is I would just note, Paul, just as a comment, having been down that road, more than once, it is a well-trammeled and well-traveled process. People know how to make it work. And I would just note that Jessica's point about, it's him that pays the piper calls the tune. So there are some, there certainly are some requirements that the DOT will want to see. They're certainly in line with what would be in this plan. But it's a process that, they understand, and a lot of people have been through it successfully, I might add. We have something in the written Q&A. And I do want to encourage people. I mean, I'm happy to read these out loud, but folks are really invited to speak up. But this is from Kyle Parker. Since implementation is likely to take a long time, will there be provisions for temporary traffic calming measures such as speed humps, traffic circles, chicanes, etc., that can improve safety while waiting for the final project?
That's a great question. So as part of the FS4A plan, we built in those road safety audits to help advance the work while we're waiting on the next round of implementation funds. And the road safety audit will be a site visit where we'll be joined by possibly DOT staff, the municipality, and other regional partners to help inform a particular corridor or stretch, an intersection project, et cetera, to help actually get out there, take pictures, and understand what we can do to improve the intersection. And that's going to be a more detailed look that can help advance the work. So rather than just wait for the implementation grants, we're hoping to use road safety audits to help support or make the argument for a project to advance. I would also mention that some eligible demonstration activities are pilots. Municipalities have the ability to pilot different projects. Under the program, we haven't recommended any pilot projects, but there is the opportunity to pilot a project that's been identified in this plan. And the reason why we're developing the Regional Safety Action Plan is to unlock access to funding. Once we've developed the Regional Safety Action Plan, all of our communities are eligible to apply for planning and demonstration grants, as well as implementation. So there are some municipalities that have Vision Zero plans, but we've developed a regional plan to help unlock the funding for our 9 communities so they don't have to apply individually. However, now that the plan is underway, they are eligible to apply directly to the federal government for these funds that will be available over the next 5 years.
And the NOFO for the planning, the next round of planning and demonstration grants is out right now, and you can apply through August 29. And we also are looking at applying for a number of the projects for planning and demonstration. So basically to advance some of the projects that are in this plan. But that is something that our communities, us applying does not make another community ineligible to apply for either planning grants, planning and demonstration, or for implementation grants the next time that comes around, which will probably be sometime in the spring of 2025.
That's correct.
So we have nothing further here online. I know it was something of a nail biter, Jessica. Do you want to try flashing up the just the here's how you comment slide?
Sure.
Just so that folks can see it if they take a moment and think if they have maybe one or 2 more questions. It is a nice evening. You could go out and wander around till it gets dark and look at places that you think are good spot for flex posts if you wanted, but I could put a speed bump there.
Okay, so it's from current slide, right?
Yeah. Maybe one again.
Oh, yeah. Good catch. Okay. Oops.
Oh, yeah.
Connect. No, I trust that.
Oh, you've got it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh,
Let me hit this.
yeah,
Okay.
is it letting you? I can connect here.
Yeah.
Samsung, I got it.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so I was told I have to screen share first. But then I lose the Zoom bar. Can
Beautiful.
you see my slides?
Yep, it's perfect.
Thank you. So on the screen here, you'll see the opportunities for public comment. Please send your emails to publiccomments@nmcog.org. I'm checking the inbox regularly, and all of the comments will be addressed and responded to at the July MPO meeting. And the public comment period ends on June 5th, June 12th. Today's June 5th.
Looks like we have another question from Brian. Brian, please.
Hey, hey, Jessica. Building off of Kyle Parker's comment about short-term action and your mention of the, I believe it's 2013 vulnerable road users law and the the new mandate to pass with a 4-foot safe distance. This is a bit tangential, but do you have background knowledge on, the efforts to educate people in our community and or enforcement initiatives in order to hopefully actually bring this on paper law into the real world in terms of behavioral change?
I know that MassDOT is working on a number of efforts. MassDOT is working on a number of efforts to educate the public on the 4-foot passing law. They started off with providing municipalities with the complimentary signs that you see posted. As far as an education campaign goes, I think that they're in the early stages of educating the public on it, and where enforcement lies with the 4-foot passing law, I'm not sure.
Cool, thanks. Sorry, I know it's tangential to the plan. I mostly asked because I haven't, the first time that I read about it was in the plan itself, so. Yeah, thank you.
I will say the signs saying, it shows a bike and it says 4 feet passing distance or, some remarks to that effect. They are blossoming all over the place. Within the past 2 weeks, I have seen them almost everywhere I go. That's in the Boston area. I don't know what you folks have got up where you are, but I have suddenly started seeing them rolling out at a quick clip. So there's that.
There was a requirement with the sign, municipalities had to have them posted within 90 days of receiving them.
We must have gotten to like 87 and a half days.
Yeah, I haven't seen very many in my area yet.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen one.
Oh,
Yeah.
Come to Chelmsford, you'll see them everywhere.
Exactly,
3 mile area where I live, and there's at least 8 within 3 miles.
Wow.
4 each way. So they're out there.
All right, I'll take a drive. Or a bike ride.
In terms of near-term ways you can enforce the 4-foot law, I've seen noodles used in social conventions, pool noodles. But yeah, otherwise it is difficult. The totally crazy, everybody's got too much money for their own good sign. I did read a story the other day that York, outside of Ontario, was trying to use drones to enforce their own passing rules. York being a very active transportation heavy focused community. That's probably, the far end crazy level maybe of that. But there are options that are emerging to kind of, start to get at things that otherwise just we're effectively lost at, are we gonna be able to enforce in practice, right? Then if somebody's got a meter stick there and you just so happen to pass and the cop is seeing the meter stick, then sure, 4 feet can easily be established. In a court, maybe a bit more difficult to really establish where the 4 foot was, right? But yeah, definitely a good point. And yeah, we will take the potential spiking early on, kind of in this transition to heart, as we go and revise. I'm thinking about how this comes out in the final. It's a valid point you all are raising here.
Well, thank you for answering my question. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the structural changes to, you know, there is no other option but compliance. So thank you.
Nothing further on the Zoom end, Jessica.
Pat, you want to formally make a comment?
I think I made my comment about the signs. Quite frankly, I think it's a little overkill, in some communities. It's interesting to me that they have so many of those signs, but yet it wasn't that long ago that they implemented the rule about hands-free, cell phones. And you never see any signs about that except at the state line.
Where'd they all go?
Yeah.
For those joining on Zoom, thank you for your interest and your attention to the study and following up for additional details in order to make the final version of it even better. I sincerely appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Brian. Thank you for your kind words.
Tried to put something in chat, but I was only able to send it to you, Nate. can't.
No, the chat was it was a thank you for the presentation. So that's why I said thank you for your kind words.
All right, go ahead and know.
So are you sticking around through the public comment period, just in case anyone else shows up? Okay.
Makes sense.
Meeting is set to end at 7:30, so we'll be on the line in case anyone drops in.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. I'm going to go finish preparations for the next public hearing. All right, thank you all.
You.
Excellent work. Thanks.
I'm not going to leave you folks. I'm just going to take a quick check downstairs and make sure the unattended third grader is all right. So I will be back with you in just a moment.
Sure. Maybe Nate has it. If possible.
What's still in effect? This meeting is happening.
Mhm. And we are here and available to answer questions.
So how did you end up becoming a board member, sir?
Is it still recording?
Yeah. Good question.
Understood, understood.
I think the question about time periods was a good one. The intention of this plan is to be a living document. So we looked at 5 years of data for right now, but to in the future update that with the next 5 years of data and so on. So you can see where that roadway network is changing and maybe we're making progress on some roads, maybe some roads are getting worse. That's helpful for targeting some of those safety dollars so that we're not doing just a snapshot in time, but trying to keep this as current as it can be.
And then when you get close to your goal, you're going to have the same problem as the airline industry does, that the data doesn't inform very well where the next one is going to occur.
Yeah, that is an issue that we see is that when you get down to a really small sample of crashes at the end, you're kind of chasing the random fatal crash or the random serious injury crash that, is perhaps behavioral. Perhaps it's, somewhat random and the underlying roadway is relatively safe, but there's some circumstance that causes that. I think the goal is certainly to get rid of the ones that we can get rid of really quickly, but it can be hard to get to that zero number. And there is sometimes a little bit of luck involved.
And to your point about the property damage, sometimes it could be something like impairment or it could be cell phone use. And those are things that we can't account for with the data, maybe, but we can account for them in terms of the policy and thinking about ways we can shift behavior. So Pat's point, for example, about signage, not seeing many signs about cell phone use. Many people don't know what is the law with the cell phones currently.
And ironically, that's in my mind, is much easier to enforce than the four
Yeah,
plates.
definitely.
And,
Yeah. Low hanging fruit.
yeah.
Yeah. Carl ended up sticking around or go home.
Thank you.
True.